the intended seriousness around the racial reckoning and the murders that happened in 2020 and all that happened to wake America up, we've watched that now start to subside. And it begs the question that if we fall off too much more, what will happen to us as a country?
Since 2020, we saw an increase in how Black Americans were being represented. This is as a result to George Floyd and what many people would call the George Floyd era. We also saw the Me Too movement, right, which kicked off even in 2019. And there's been many instances where not only Black Americans, but also women that have been able to take the charge and really understand what's happening and how we can grow from there. The same can also be said about the Crown Act. The same could be said about programming, even on television, where we see channels like OWN and BET and BET Plus and even HBO and several other stations that are creating instances where people are able to share their cultural backgrounds and to be proud about the skin color. That includes Black and brown people, Black and brown men and women. I would also beg to differ that this pathway of change can also be viewed as a facade to many people. And we have to take that instance where we understand that we don't need a temporary Band-Aid on how people show up in the media. We don't need a temporary Band-Aid in the support for Black and brown people. That type of change needs to stay.
If we don't put serious effort into diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, racial equity, whatever we choose to call it, if we think 2020 was the year that really impacted our country, we don't want to know what the future of America looks like if there's another situation in which that happens again. I don't know that I want to see it. I want to be part of the solution, and that's the work that we're doing now. That's the work that your DEI practitioners are doing now.
I think that one of the benefits of the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many, many others was that it was a rebirth of a movement that was not new. Right? We talk about Black Lives Matter. I think it just took a new name. You go back to civil rights, and even before then, there have been movements. And when we talk about the issues that individuals from the Black and brown communities and others have been highlighting, it's not new. It's been ongoing for generations before us. In fact, it was worse at a certain point, and we're seeing some sort of progress, but not enough progress. So I don't believe America gets it yet, and I say that in the most respectful way possible, but in a very pointy way as well.
back in the summer of 2020, I actually gave notice to Discover that I was going to leave the firm. And that was really spirited out of the racial pandemic, essentially. After the murder of George Floyd, I really struggled with kind of understanding my significance with the purpose for my own life, right? I was living in Salt Lake City, and at a time in which Salt Lake is not the most diverse place to live, and I'm watching turmoil and chaos across the country, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods like Chicago. And so I knew I wanted to do more purpose-driven work, and quite honestly, I thought at the time I would have to leave corporate America to do that. I would have to kind of go to a social service agency or nonprofit agency or something that allowed me to be more proximate to people who were down and out. But once Discover aligned on wanting to kind of uplift our mission of having people have a brighter financial future and leveraging that to put our jobs where they can matter more, and having the opportunity to do that in Chicago, 5 minutes from where I grew up, wasn't a coincidence for me, and I knew it was the right thing for me to be doing at the time.
You can't just hope for that to be different. You have to do something to make that different. So one of the first things we did was set North Star goals. And we said, this was 2019, beginning of 2020, that by 2025, we wanted every single level of people leadership we have. So 1,000 people managers and 600 directors and 150 officers of the company. So you put that together, 1,900 or so, that at each level, we wanted 40% representation people of color, and within that 15% Black and Latinx, and then also 50% representation of women. For us, it's having that goal and that very specific target, has energized kind of efforts around that, making sure we have diverse candidate slates for every position, making sure that our interview panels are diverse as well, making sure that all of our recruiters, making sure that all of our hiring managers are going through efforts. And quite honestly, what I think is most important is educating decision makers, exposing those who are making the decisions, those white men who sit in those roles and are making decisions about who is up and coming, exposing them and diversifying their networks so they have broader perspective on what could be possible.
I can remember when I first was asked about this work, and I was, again, on the margins of whether or not I wanted to stay at Discover. I didn't want to work on an initiative that was, window dressing as a result of the racial pandemic. And one of the very first conversations I had was a conversation with our CEO. Having a conversation with him was very eye-opening for me because it was not something he wanted to do as an act of charity, et cetera. I believe that there is a strong belief in his own beliefs.
You made a decision, because ultimately you're the CEO, and part of your business, a key part is the call center operations. And I believe the last center you all had invested and launched from the ground up was nearly 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
In Salt Lake City. And then we get to, which is key to your business, the call center. And you as a CEO either have to support it or suggest it. Was everybody thrilled about that?
Some people were. I think a lot of people questioned the decision. And from a conventional business logic, it was a bit of a stretch.
Why did you want to do this? Why did you want to lead the organization in this?
I thought it was our responsibility. And a lot of companies talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but how many really try and do something meaningful and do it within the construct of their business? Don't do it on the side.
Yeah.
And so this really came together with, my hearing Ibram Kendi speak, right, on the importance of not just being not racist, but being an anti-racist and being a positive force for change. And then just thinking about systemic bias, how sort of inequity, right, or inequality reinforces itself decade after decade, and that you need to take action to break the cycle. And I'd watched, a very large company, go from rich community to figure out who would pay them the most in incentives. And it just felt unfair. And so I thought, okay, what can Discover do? Well, we have great products and great jobs. Let's bring jobs to a community that's been underinvested in. And we don't have to look around the country. We can just look on the south and west side right here in Chicago. And let's do this as a company. And I was convinced that one way or another, it would work out great.
Why are you still the outlier of white men in leadership who go, well, it just, right is right, wrong is wrong. It doesn't matter if it impacts me. Were there times during this where you worried that you had put your equity on the line because ultimately you did as CEO? Was there times that you feared that this didn't work? And are there times now that you look at this and go, wow, what some saw as an experiment has the potential to change in such a dramatic way how we do business and how we implement DEI initiatives through the DNA? What lessons were learned here that you did not expect?
Yeah. So first I would say, and I don't want to take away from the decision, but I actually think the more privilege you have, the easier it is to take risks, right? I mean, say I get fired, right? I've done very well at Discover. It's not like my family's going to be homeless. And I would say from the very beginning, our board of directors, who are a diverse group, were 100% supportive. They never once asked about the cost, and they just said, gosh, this is the greatest thing, keep us posted. So I had really strong support from a very important constituency for any CEO. And I guess I tend to be optimistic. The underlying model, which is in a time where everyone is competing for employees in the same locations, let's go to a location where we will be the employer of choice. And that just seemed to make so much sense to me that I was convinced this would work out well. And we have a lot of experience. Some things don't work well the first time, but then you keep at it, you reinvent, you find different ways, you innovate, and you figure out how to make it work. So it almost never crossed my mind that this would not work. I knew there'd be challenges, but I was confident from the beginning.
Where are you on your journey with race, equity, DEI, the use of your privilege, the holding yourself and others that you may have access to that I do not? Where are you at on that journey personally, if I may ask?
I feel like I'm making progress, but have a ways to go. And there's nothing like having kids to help you know what areas you need to improve in. But
you're a board of directors.
Yeah. I think it's part of the nature of privilege that those who have it don't necessarily notice it. And so I talked about meeting my wife at Merrill Lynch. A woman who worked with us, Lisa Cleveland, is black. And I remember early on talking to her, and she pointed out, well, you probably haven't had the experience of being followed around a retail store. And I was like, no, actually, I haven't. And so I think you don't always understand the privilege you have, but you can.
My lean into diversity actually came through disability inclusion and disability employment. So my younger brother is autistic, and so I've spent a good part of my adult life advocating for disability inclusion. I was the executive sponsor at Discover when we started our first disability employee resource group. And so that was kind of my entree of like caring. You know, I look back now with regret. I spent, not regret, but like realizing, you know, I did not have perhaps when I had, you know, kind of rising positions within Discover in business roles, I did not have as much of a focus on all diversity as I do today. And that kind of haunts me and almost inspires me now to make a bit more of a difference.
Yeah, I am proud. I you know, oftentimes reflect on like where we started. I can remember being early in my career at Discover. I started out my career in the Phoenix office. And I can remember just trying to look around and just see a physical manifestation of what I wanted to be in my career, and I could never find one.
I like coming in every day and seeing leadership that looks like me. I like coming in and seeing people who have known this community, grown up in this community, supported this community all their lives, be happy that this place is now here inside the community and provides so much for the community.
That's definitely how all workplaces should be. You should want to come to work. You should want to, when you get here, be comfortable in your own skin. You shouldn't be on edge at work. You should be relaxed. And here I'm very much relaxed.
And the fact that we're able to stop and acknowledge without skepticism, without reservation, the impact that our Chatham Center has had on the entire company and the way we're moving, right? I can't express enough that if not for the success here, we wouldn't be making other decisions about real estate and the neighborhoods that we can locate it. And so, but I do think that requires a shift of power for individuals to acknowledge that it's because of the success that we've experienced on the South Side that we can kind of chart forward and become the company that we want to become.
Today, you have a job interview.
Can I help you? Oh, you must be Mr. Sterling. Mr. Murphy will be right with you. Is that your resume in your hand? Please put that in the box. Here.
Hey, what's up, man? Hey, what's your name again? These interviews have been crazy. Glad they're almost over.
Hello. You must be our candidate from Yale.
No, sir. I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State. I'm Brad Johnson. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to interviewing with you.
Go Spartans. Michigan State is a great school. Come on in.
Mr. Murphy, Mr. Sterling is our candidate from Yale.
Oh, hello, Mr. Sterling. Sorry, didn't notice you there. I'll meet with Brad and then come back for Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling, you don't mind, do you?
Is that them?
Hi, Michael. I just wanted to call and thank you for coming in to interview today. You're an incredibly qualified candidate. However, we decided to go with someone else who was a slightly better fit for the culture of our agency. Best of luck.
I can definitely speak to what it's like being the only Black person in the room. And it's a feeling of wondering, why isn't there someone else in this space that looks like me? And does everyone else in this room notice that I'm the only Black person in this space? And sometimes you feel good about that because you feel like you're in a space where someone else doesn't have access to. But then sometimes you feel bad because you feel like I shouldn't be the only person in this room.
I'll take you to my earliest memories of being, I would say, mistreated. And maybe even was in a situation where I felt clearly I was being discriminated against. And that was back in my teens. I'm a boomer and a 70s baby. So my coming of age in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And I really loved Fashion Fair. And every year they would come to, I'm from Dayton, Ohio, they would come through, have the fashion show, and I just thought it was spectacular. And that was also at the time where Jet Magazine was coming along as well. And I'm a tall person in stature, and so I wanted to be a model. And in my teen years, I had an opportunity to go for a photo shoot tryout for a catalog. That's when they actually used to look and turn pages to see what the fashions were and how to buy things. So I went for a tryout, and I was given the opportunity to take some shots with a small group of other young girls They all were white. I was the only black person who was in these small groups. And the photographer literally stood up and looked at my direction and said, you know, you are just too dark to be photographed next to them. And so I was kind of stunned in the moment, but I kept with, you know, I had a task to complete, so I kept with it at that time. But in reflecting back, I remember thinking, as I was returning home that day, that, you know, you probably should go ahead and make sure you get a good education, because you may or may not be able to make a living off of your looks.
There was a time in my career where, you know, I was the it factor. I had it. I knew I had it, right? And yes, there's a little bit of ego in there, but it was also real. And it came time for performance reviews. And my manager says to me, hey, I know that you've exceeded expectations, but I've got to rate you a meets expectation, because I've got to do a bell curve distribution. I can't have too many folks exceeding the expectation. So I'm going to give you a meets expectation. And so knowing, because I was in HR, I knew that was directly tied to my annual salary increase and also my bonus. And my words were, like, if you can disconnect your decision to get me a meets expectation, but maintain giving me the bonus and the salary increase that comes with and exceeds, I don't care what you call me, but do not mess with my money.
I have many experiences where my race wasn't necessarily to my detriment, but it definitely played significant negative roles in my life. One example of that was asking for pay parity in the workplace. There was a white woman who was my peer in this space, and we had the same team dynamic, similar degrees, different academic institutions, but similar academic background. And what I requested was pay parity. Instead, what I was offered was an increased role with differential pay, meaning as long as you take on this extra role, we will pay you equal to the white woman who is your peer. And I found myself saying, but that's not what I asked for. I asked for pay parity. Make me equal to this person. And finding the only difference between myself and that woman was that she was white and that I was black.
Early last year, when I was looking to get out of logistics before I took this job, so I did an interview. You know, I talked about myself on paper. That was all great. I was receiving great responses. You know, we can't wait to have you for a Zoom interview. We can't wait to see you. We can't wait to talk to you. I did a phone interview as well, and everything was fine. I was told that the Zoom interview would be at least 30 minutes. I believe that the interview didn't last the full 10. And I do believe on the interview call, on the Zoom call, there were 3 interviewers present and only 1 remained by the end of the call. I'm not sure if it was my hair or you know, just my skin color, honestly. I think at that point, once they saw me, they kind of knew what direction they were going to head with that.
One instance of the interview process that I had was my zip code, the actual zip code of where I lived. So I applied for this role, and at the time, I was putting my zip code on my resume. I did get called into the interview, and it was face-to-face, and it was by a white man. And apparently he knew the city and knew it well. And so at that time, my zip code was 60620, which is the Chatham community in Chicago. He knew that right away. And he asked me, so that's the Chatham community, right? And I just was taken aback by that, because what it suggested to me was that if you're looking at zip codes, might you underestimate the talent of an individual or recognize this community as a predominantly Black community in the city and not make a job offer or have someone come in to an interview based on that?
My previous employer, of course, it wasn't many African Americans there. And I would feel like I wasn't supported. Like, we would have meetings, and I would have an idea, someone else would have an idea, but they would piggyback off my idea.
They would hear them in idea.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
Unappreciated, like I didn't belong, like I was being profiled as well.
And I also felt like, how dare he be a dream killer? How dare he just, make such a sweeping statement and put me at an immediate deficit for something that I didn't really have any control over. And I think that to this day just kind of sticks out in my mind from the standpoint of do what you can to play your game, on your terms. Because not everyone is just going to greet you with open arms with all the value that you think you are bringing to the table.
Why and how has cancel culture impeded racial equity in the workplace?
The impact of cancel culture has been, I believe, putting up even bigger barriers for us to have the conversations we need to have about racial equity. Created an absence of dialogue where we should have more.
It has engendered a spirit of fear, almost, in the workplace, that people don't want to drive or even cultivate conversations that are honest or that may be uncomfortable because someone might be offended, and so you say, you can't say anything. But the only way to correct something is for someone to say it.
I have an opportunity to interact with a lot of executives, and particularly white executives are fearful of even asking the very questions that they should be asking as leaders of these organizations for fear of cancel culture. So it's not even getting to the dialogue's not even started because the question is being afraid. We're afraid of the questions to ask, and I think that just further entrenches us in where we are.
Where's the grace for learning on all sides, right?
Sure.
And we were talking earlier, like, where's the grace that, hey, I might not get it right all the time, but where's my opportunity to kind of learn and fumble and stumble? It's like a kid walking. A kid just doesn't wake up one morning and I'm going to run a sprint and start walking.
Exactly.
There's a process to build that confidence and that knowing that I think is even more amplified because of the rate of change in knowledge and information that's moving now. Things just move that much faster.
So I wonder if there's a space for anonymity, right? For, say, a survey, in-house survey that addresses certain issues that might allow people the space to be candid and honest, and at the same time give them the cover of anonymity so that we can then have the conversation without being judgmental.
How can we change this fear into acceptance?
Well, I think we have to have different conversations, and we have to, I love this notion of giving grace. We have to create grace and space. If we're going to really look at dismantling systems of racism in organizations, which were built on a racist structure in and of itself, we're going to have to fumble and get it wrong.
Yeah, I think we're operating on two extreme levels. A level of fear, and then for a lot of young Black people, the level of exhaustion. They're just tired.
Very true.
And they want to see the change, especially the young professionals who are quick to leave an organization because of the lack of DEI initiatives or the lack of care. You know, they feel that they don't care, and young professionals really feel that they should not be taking the stance of educating others.
That's very true. That's very
So
true.
Especially my leaders.
Yeah.
Especially my leaders. We have to change that mindset.
I think it is incumbent on all of us who know better to speak up. You know, so often people are able to spread ignorance because those who know better won't say anything. And we just can't afford that luxury anymore.
I agree.
We cannot. In every venue and every, you know, whether you're talking about legislatures or whether you're talking about library boards or whether you're talking about board of trustees with colleges and universities, you know, we have to be willing to say, you know what, this just is unacceptable.
That goes back to something you said about a lot of our colleagues. We have to be mindful that they don't come from diverse communities. Or they didn't go to diverse colleges or schools. So what is the role that the media is playing with the portrayal of African Americans?
You know, you raise a great point, and I just had this conversation this morning with my husband because we were in Indianapolis and the NRA was there. And so he was out smoking with them. And he said, you know, some of those NRA guys were pretty nice. And I said, they probably said the same thing about you. And, you know, you think about the stereotypes that we have built up for each other. Or, you know, what does the NRA guy look like? You know, Doug Dynasty.
And you said a guy. It's not necessarily.
Exactly.
Right.
So, you know, we all have stereotypes. It's just that very often Black people are at the end of being negatively portrayed by those stereotypes. But you're absolutely right. You know, how we appear in the media, how we think about each other. And it impacts how we treat each other and how we address each other.
And when we have so few African Americans represented at the C-suite level, the opportunity for exposure for counter views, for me to have a different experience than what I may be receiving from the media, is limited. That's why representation goes far beyond just the numbers and the counting. Representation is about the experience not only of African Americans in the workplace, but quite frankly, of their white and other people of color, how they experience each other culturally. And I struggle with representation being a numbers only game, because the impact of representation is far greater for us as a society beyond just any one racial group in a positive way. So
true. So true.
But how do we turn it around? how do we increase the number of African Americans in the C-suite when so many, I believe it's 84%, of African Americans are just in junior positions?
I get asked that question a lot from particularly white male executives, like, oh, we've been chasing, this goal or this target, and look, we're not moving the needle. What do we do? And my answer, flippantly, often is, well, first of all, I need you to find a new set of friends.
Yeah.
I need you to start interacting in different circles and different professional communities where you're exposed and proximate to people who are markedly different than you are. And it starts with you and your individual behavior in that regard, because that will give you access. We talk about access in a lot of ways, but not always this way. That will give you access to view talent in a different way. And I think it's find a new network. We need leaders to start finding new networks.
Scott, I'm going to add on to that. You talk about access. So for those leaders who need to put themselves in new environments so that they can have access to talent, I also think one of the other benefits that comes out of that is then then I can also learn how to provide and support agency and advocacy.
Absolutely.
Because,
and allyship.
All the A's, right?
Yep.
So access, advocacy, agency, allyship, all of that, because if you don't understand the human-to-human connection, you're going to do like most organizations. Their recruiting machine is going to run and go hire all the black and people of color that they can, and then 18 months later, they're like, where did they go? They went right out the back door because they didn't have the access inside the organization. They didn't get the agency that needed, the advocacy or the allyship to be able to grow and thrive within that environment.
There's this theory I like to share often that talks about workplace culture and how culture is formed in any community. And so I'll tell you a story about the 5 wet monkeys, and maybe you've heard it. All right, try to keep it as quickly as possible. 5 wet monkeys in a science lab. There were scientists had these monkeys in a cage, 5 of them. They tied a string to a banana, dropped it down the top of the cage. The monkeys instinctively jumped and grabbed the banana. The scientists took a fire hose and sprayed water on the monkeys. We repeated this exercise until the monkeys learned not to grab that banana when it comes down the cage. The scientists then took the fire hose, put it away and store it somewhere, never to be brought out ever again. They then went to a different country and imported a new monkey in. They took one of the veteran monkeys, or the monkeys that had been there a while, out with a new monkey, and now there were 4 veteran monkeys and 1 new monkey, and they brought down the banana on the string. What happened? The new monkey instinctively dashed and went to the banana. What was interesting was the 4 other monkeys jumped the new monkey to restrain the monkey from grabbing the banana. They repeated this exercise over and over again until all 5 older monkeys were replaced with newer monkeys. And they kept this process going until there were over 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, and on changes of monkeys. And realized at a certain point, none of the monkeys went for the banana on the string. However, none of the monkeys currently in the cage ever saw the fire hose. So when you think about what you just talked about, is if we don't do a good job explaining how we got here, what's happened is that we have formed behaviors to adapt and survive. That the generations, all they see is the behaviors we are depicting, not understanding where it's coming from, and it's passed through generations. So the lack of that education and reality is a tremendous gap in almost fixing or addressing the issue.
You have to define talent in a different way, right? Define what it means to be qualified. So much of the conversation about how do you hire, who do you hire, has to do with people who meet certain criteria. But it's always different. The criteria is different from me than it may be for Scott. You know, I've got to have an Ivy League degree. I've got to have all of this experience. And while he has to have a degree, it may not necessarily be the same.
And my favorite, Karen, is when it's talked about as fit.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't fit. Fit
Yeah,
being
it's
code
gotta be
for.
the- yeah.
Like,
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Love it.
To me, it's just that's code for you're discriminating.
But what about you're going out to hire these external candidates when you have talent already at the organization? How are you moving them?
Yeah, because there's this concept in the world of human capital data called mobility equity, right? So it's where you're looking at the different segments of the workforce, and are they moving at a proportionate rate of their representation in the organization, or are they adversely impacted? And so these are the things when we talk about what's going to help change and drive equity inside of organizations. Leaders have to stay attuned to those things because those are decisions that are happening every moment and in between. And as I mentioned earlier on the recruiting front, most organizations will put their attention there because guess what? It's visible. You can see, oh, we're out at this job fair, we're out here, we're doing this. Yeah, we're inclusive. We even have our little EEO statement at the end of our ads. Yay, us, right? However, the stuff in between when folks are inside the organization and they start running into the headwinds of the toxicity in organizations, the fear in organization, the retaliation that happens in some organization, that right there you don't see.
Lunch invitations,
right?
And everybody doesn't get one.
Right, all of that. Right?
All of those things.
Yeah.
I want to go backwards for just a second to the notion of network and who our leaders have access to. And I think there also is something I just want to underscore. When I think we give leaders cover, or they feel a false sense of comfort from my view, when I have one African American member on my exec team, or I have one woman on the exec team. And it's like, well, we're good. We have representation, but what that does, it gives me access to one singular experience, and not any one of us can speak to or represent the full racial experience of any of our races. And so there's something about I need access and proximity to more numbers than one.
Yeah.
What do you think the next generation of CEOs need to know if they want to make a real difference, an impactful difference in the DEI space? Not our existing CEOs.
Okay, next gen. Next gen. Okay. One of the things I throw on the table for consideration that I think is around. We were talking about learning. I think leaders are going to have to find themselves moving into more generative style of learning. Things are moving much faster, so things are changing. So how do I stay current and relevant in understanding the nuance of human behavior inside an organization, and then how systems are now set up and running? And I just think about myself, the amount of content that I have to consume just to stay relevant.
Yeah. Especially our young CEOs of color, they will have to take the time to educate.
Yeah.
They will have to do that.
Yes.
I would also say that they need to really understand that DEI really is good for the bottom line. They have to see it, right? Someone has to demonstrate. I know there's a McKinsey study out there as an example that shows the value, but there are any number of ways to quantify the value of having a diverse team at every level of an organization. And I think we, just like you train them on every other aspect of the work that they do, they have to be trained on that aspect of it.
Karen, I'm going to build on that because when I was thinking about the response, you've got to have the business acumen. That's a non-negotiable. It always has been. Right? You're a cultural leader. And when we talk about leading an organization, you mentioned the aspiration that you set against DEI, or add the belonging or access to that. How are you embedding that into your leadership journey as an up and coming CEO, as much as you're developing your business acumen? Because I think navigating those internal cultures is just as important as navigating the financial statements.
Very true. Very true.
What do you think will need to happen from a community lens in order for us to make some lasting impacts in DEI?
I think we want to see a lot of good trouble from the community. I think that you want to see community-based organizers continue to keep this in the forefront. Consistent gatherings, convenings where you're talking about not only that it's important, but how do you get it done?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Culture change is possible in any workplace and in any workspace simply because people are people. And as long as we understand humanity and we want to treat people with kindness and offer an inclusive space, it should work. However, will it work when you have people that have an indirect access to your leaders? That's questionable. It really depends on what leadership looks like. There are instances where you have leaders or people in the C-suite that are all about it. They're all about change. And then there are instances where the C-suite is, to a degree, change averse. They don't really feel like diversity, equity, and inclusion needs a space within the C-suite, or it's a managerial level role and really doesn't need to go much farther than that. I would argue that you can get more done when you place a key decision maker in diversity, equity, and inclusion in your C-suite, because they have direct access to the change makers in your organization, or the key decision makers, I should say, within the organization. That should not be the way, but as a DEI expert in this field, I've found that that's a less challenging way to find success in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
If you look at our population, we are shifting from baby boomers, and we're seeing millennials, Gen Zs, and we're seeing a shift happen, a big shift happen. What's going to happen is that your top talent, the best talent in the market, are going to be people who are of diverse backgrounds, period. And what's going to happen is if you don't have processes in place, leadership in place, who's able to harness such a talent to produce great business outcomes, you will struggle for talent and you will not be a good leader. The demand, the expectation, the responsibility for leadership is shifting. So this is not just on our CEOs. This is on our deans of schools, on our presidents of schools and universities and colleges. We need to begin to develop individuals who have the competencies to lead in a global world.
We have to be able to create that connection between how we build strong relationships with our communities, how we see the way in which media portrays the people in our very lives. We need to be behind the lens of those cameras. We need to be behind the lens of all of those teams and those boardrooms in order to create the connection so that our children 20, 30 years from now, they see images that are positive of Black and brown people. They see images that represent what beauty is in culture, what beauty is in the humanity of our world. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is if we are behind those lenses, that we are behind the work that comes out.
And so when you think about when you're learning to appreciate people that are different than you, how to be more inclusive and equitable, guess what? We're all going to stumble. But how much grace are we giving each other as we learn to create a new container that is more inclusive? You just don't wake up into an inclusive container. Everybody's on a learning journey, and how much grace do we give each other as we're moving through that journey? And so I think that's one of the things that I think makes the difference in those good, better, best organizations is how open are they to learning and how open are they to giving each other grace as they learn.